Okay, we've got everything prepped up along the edges. Everything's cleaned up around the inside edges and double glued. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come through and I'm going to glue all the surfaces that I plan to glue my turtle deck down to. I'm going to go ahead and get that done in advance around the fuel tank holes here, so that we can prepare to put the fabric on the turtle deck. Just going to glue right up to this edge here, right around the front of that, up underneath that edge. And we're going to pre-glue around the fuel tank hole, all the way around that tube. Right back through here. And we'll have a little bit of fabric right in here, so we'll go ahead and glue around that edge. Be a finished seam across through there. We can wrap that all the way around that inside edge right there. And we'll also glue straight across this deck right here. Where your control cables drop down through there on the Mark III Extra. A little different on the Mark III Classic, but along the same lines. Glue along this edge here, around that inside edge, and we're going to go ahead and cover this right on back to this deck here. And the same thing over on this side, all the way along our fuel tank opening, all the way around the tube. All the way across the front of this tube. And underneath it to tuck all the way back in. And that should have us covered. I'm going to put a little glue along this edge here. And this edge here. And we'll let that set up, and we'll get our fabric cut to go in the turtle deck. I should be able to use the scrap fabric left over from covering the bottom of the fuselage, which I set aside. So as soon as I figure out what piece of fabric we're going to use there, I'm hoping we have enough scrap to be able to take care of that. All right, I've dug out a piece of fabric here from my scrap pile. This is a piece of fabric I cut off the edge of the bottom when I covered the very bottom of it, so I'm able to use it. It fits in here just fine. I've kind of just roughly trimmed it to where it'll fit. Cut just one little notch right here to go around this, so that I know I have enough fabric to wrap all the way around the front. So I'm going to go ahead and start tacking this down. I'll start tacking it along this edge, and then once I get the front edge glued down and a tack edge around my fuel tank trays, I'll go ahead and cut these out, and then I'll start working on this back edge. So I'm just going to start tacking this front edge down right here over to my fuel tank tray, just right in there. It's always a good idea before you start trimming in the back to get the front edge tacked down so that it doesn't move on you. And you know you don't run out of fabric. Pull a little tension across that. Move this edge down. That's stuck into place there. Okay, I've got that tacked into place. I'm going to let that set up for just a little bit. Then I'm going to go ahead and come through here and I'm going to glue around the edge, just the top edge of my fuel tank trays, and then I'll go ahead and start cutting out this notch. You can see I pulled just a little tension across through there so that that'll work out pretty nice for us. Okay, we've got our turtle deck tacked down now. I've tacked it along the front edge. I went ahead and closed this in right here and got this wrapped around, and I've glued around the edges of my fuel tank trays. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and mark these fuel tank trays, or the openings for the fuel tanks. I'm going to mark them out about a 1/2 inch, and what that'll do is it'll save us from having to go underneath to trim these out. We'll just make these finished cuts. That way they wrap the right distance underneath there. Just mark them just like that, and we'll pre-glue those. So that they don't fray, and we can do a finished seam underneath. And that'll wrap the right distance in there. And then you can just take these corners and just cut them right back into the corners. And those will just wrap right under and be finished. I haven't glued anything on these sides yet. I've just glued the fuel tank holes and the leading edge up here. I'm going to go ahead and pre-glue those and cut those out. Then we'll be able to jump back and start cutting around this back here. Okay, so I'm going to let that tack up, and then I'm going to go ahead and start gluing this back to about here, and then we'll start cutting around this back tray back here. Alright, I've gone ahead and trimmed all of this around through here, and I've gotten everything lapped up underneath the bottom. And we've got a nice seam under here. I've glued this edge back to here, and I've tucked all of this under and trimmed everything around the front. Now our next mission is to get this piece cut around the back here. We've got a little bit to get around, so we're going to get our pencil and go ahead and map out what we're going to do. We can just lift our fabric up like that, reach back to where we want to cut that at. And go ahead and put a little mark in there. Pull this up through here where that mark's going to be, where that cut's going to be. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and cut around all of this without having any open seams, so we'll have to find our back cut when we get there. So I'm going to glue this up and start trimming this around, and we'll get back on it. Okay, I'm going to get the camera down and show you where we're at here. We've got all of our fuel tank trays are wrapped and in, and I've mapped out the brackets in the back that hold the control cables for the ailerons, and I've cut them out of the fabric here so that we can lay all this back through there. So I've pre-glued this edge and all of this everywhere around through here. At that point we're ready to just start folding all this into place, tucking everything where it goes. It should fit around there pretty nice. Okay, there we go. Once I get all that glued down, that's going to be tucked in. We'll get this tacked all the way across this top edge up here, and then we'll be ready to do our seam lap right here, and we'll go ahead and mark that out and get it done. Okay, we've got everything cut and fitted back through here. I'm going to go ahead and start gluing all this down. I'm going to start right on this back edge here. So I'll just pull that down and glue it into place. Yeah, I'm going to do this all the way around all the rest of these parts, and then we'll get this top edge tacked right here, and we'll be ready to go ahead and start working on our lap. All right, I've come through and I've cut all of these around all of this stuff, and I've glued everything down around the edges, just roughly. Then I cut a little strip of aluminum. It's about 7/8 of an inch wide. Then I'm going to take my pencil. Rather than trying to drag this, there's so much stuff in the way. I generally just take my little straight edge like this. I just go ahead and draw that line. Also kind of holds the fabric kind of flat around those edges. And get us a nice neat line going down through here. Take that line, we'll go ahead and seal this around through here where we're going to finish that. Just go ahead and seal that line right down through there so the fabric doesn't fray. All the way down through there. Then we'll let that glue set up. We'll trim that line. So while that's setting up, I'm going to go ahead and draw the other side. And put a little seal on it also. Make sure that didn't stick to anything before we start to cut it. Then we'll just go ahead and cut this right along that line. Nice neat line through there. That's going to show forever. And again, I was holding tension back with this hand so that that fabric doesn't try to curl up. Just like that. Alright, I've got that sealed. Now the next thing I'll do is I'll just get my brush here, and we'll go ahead and start working that line. This is going to be a little difficult up on the top like this. You should lay it over on its side, but I generally just head right on. So I'm just gonna put my glue just on the tape itself, just about a foot at a time. And then we can just go ahead and seal that right down from the outside. Just like that. You can see that makes a nice little seam through there. Glue right on there. Just like that. I'll work this all the way to the back edge. Getting that seam done. This fabric's on a little bit of a bias. Fabric's cross-grained, so you can do a lot of work with it if it starts to wrinkle or give you any problems being in a straight line. It'll stretch a little. So if you let your glue get too dry, it'll actually drag it, and you don't want to do that. You want your glue good and wet. Just like that. If you run too many times with your brush, you'll start fraying the edges back up again, so you want to just get it there and stop. And that's a good looking seam. We're going to do the same thing back here and finish this one on out. Just like that. Now we'll let that set up for just a little bit, and then we'll be ready to tuck this back edge under and trim it just like we've done all of our other edges, and then I'll be ready to iron everything up in here. All this is already glued. I will come around this with a shoe iron, and I'll just make sure that everything is down good along these edges, because there's not much of a lap right there. It's a little bit tight, so we'll make sure everything's stuck down good with the shoe iron, and then we'll come back with the big iron. We've glued our edges all the way down through here. Everything's glued and finished all the way. We've let our glue set up on our seam. Now we're going to take our little shoe iron, and we're just going to go along the edges here and make sure that everything is well tacked down along these edges, so that when we tension our fabric, it doesn't pull anything loose. Everything's glued well and it looks fine. We can go, while we got our shoe iron in our hand, we can go ahead and finish up all these back edges back here. Because we'll iron the front of this up here with the big iron. We'll just tighten everything up around this back edge. Back in there. Get everything down nice and neat. Come up around the front just a little bit here. Coming up very nice. Then we'll get our big iron. Again, we're just setting at 250. We'll go and iron all this in. Everything tensioned up real nice. All right, and that's got our turtle deck done. Tension to 250. The next step we're going to do is we're going to go back. We're going to make a couple of patches for around our gear legs. We're going to throw those on, and then we'll be able to take this whole fuselage and just get our iron fired back up, and we'll take everything to 350 degrees on the fuselage. So we'll turn our iron up to 350, re-iron everything, being very careful not to touch any of our seams with our iron, or the fabric that's over the seams will they'll shrink up. So you don't want to do that. Just tension just the open bays of the fabric. And that's got our fuselage fairly well covered. We'll get back when I'm ready to do the patches for the sides. Okay, we've got our We've got our fuselage covered all of our surfaces. Now we're going to make a couple of patches to go around the gear leg to reinforce the fabric around those areas where they got just a light amount of fabric on them. So what I use is an inspection ring. You can use anything that's round, cup, little saucer, plate, anything that's got the right radius for you. I just happen to usually have several of these laying around. So I'm just going to draw my rings on there the way I want them. Just like that. I'm going to take my pinking shears and I'm going to go ahead and trim those out. One down. Alright, just got our two pieces of patches to go on the sides. We'll reposition the camera and get over there on the fuselage and show you how to cut these out to fit on there. Alright, we've got our patch cut out. And we're ready to go ahead and try and get it fitted on here. What I do is I just slide my inspection ring that I used to cut that out with. It's just the right size. I just lay it right on, hanging over the edge, pull it around, just go ahead and draw that circle on there, right around that gear leg, just like that. Then we can take our patch, and I can just set it right on the bottom underneath here, and get it where it'll make the round around those edges, matches the size. And then I just draw a straight line from side to side right here. And then I know that I want this to fold up both sides, so I'm just going to draw a line right in the center right here. And then I'll take this section and I'll just draw a little triangle in it because I want that to lap up in here. And then I want these sides right up through here. I want them to lay right in that seam, and this piece to glue up on the sides of this. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the table and I'm going to glue this so that it doesn't fray on me. And I'll cut that, and then we'll come back and we'll get our cut trims for the top. Okay, I've gone over and glued my seams, places that I want to cut so that it doesn't fray. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place that little triangle right up in that hole of the gear leg. I'm going to get this to where it sits in the way I want it to sit. And I'm going to draw me a line right there where I want to cut that off to not go up around that edge. and I want a straight line right across there. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Right across there. And I'll just go ahead and just cut them on out of there. Just like that. Just like that. And I'm just going to take my glue and I'm just going to touch those edges so that they don't fray. We'll let that set up just a little bit and then we'll be ready to glue that on. Okay, while that's setting up, we can go ahead and put a base coat down on the circle that we're going to glue to. Right up the sides, everywhere this is going to stick, up through the center, around this side. Alright, that looks real good. We're going to let that dry for just a moment. Then once that starts to set up, we'll just come right back through and just put another fresh wet coat on top of that, and we'll stick our patch right into it and then brush it on down. Just like that. And we'll take our patch and we'll start out right at that bottom piece where we wanted that to lay in there. We're just sticking this right in that wet glue bed, just like that. Pull everything up, just so happens to fit just like we expected it to. So we can just go ahead and come on back with our wet glue and just go ahead and press that right on in there. Just like that. Got to move along a little quick on these because they're, while that glue is wet under there, if you really want these to stick to the sides of that real good and strong, so just press everything in. Just like that. And then just kind of smooth everything out. Make sure you don't have anything running anywhere, which we do not. That looks like that's good and soaked down. That'll do just fine. Once you get that patch on both sides, you're ready to go ahead and iron your fuselage to 350 degrees. Okay, we've let our glue set up on our patches on the sides. And now we're ready to go ahead and iron the entire fuselage to 350 degrees. I've preset my iron, I've checked it with my gauge. And we're ready to go ahead and iron this. You want to pay particular attention while you're ironing to 350 that you do not touch your seams where they're wrapped over the edges, so it's best just to go ahead and make a run all the way down the edge of it, because if you touch them, they will shrink and pull back from your nice neat line that you made earlier. You want to go ahead and let your iron lay on the fabric for a little while. You don't want to rush across it. Make sure that the fabric all gets up to 350 degrees. you can't leave the iron on there too long, so you don't have to worry about rushing across it. It's not going to melt if you're checking your temperature, and you make sure it does not get over 350 degrees. The fabric will melt at about 450 degrees, so you definitely don't want to be there. At about 400 degrees, the fabric will start relaxing again, and then it will not shrink again. So you want to get it real good and tight. Now it should be, I've already ironed this side over here, so that ends up as tight as a drum. Again, I'm just going to run along the edge of that seam so I make sure I don't get on it. Take your time. You also want to make sure while you're ironing, you don't drag the tip of the iron, because it will leave a little mark in the fabric that'll show in your paint later. So make sure your iron's laying nice and flat. Don't put too much pressure on it, just enough to do what you're looking for. Okay, that's got the whole bottom to 350 degrees. And I'm going to do the same on the sides, again avoiding my seams and any of my patches, make sure it doesn't pull any of those or shrink them out of shape. And I'll be ready to clean this up and go ahead and go for brush coat. I'm going to go ahead and iron the turtle deck also. I think you've got the idea on how that works. And we'll jump back on for brush coat. Alright, I've mixed up our poly brush to brush our cage. This is 3 parts poly brush to 1 part 8500 reducer is what I use. I like my brush coat to dry real slow because I try and get a sheen on the surface as I'm brush coating. So I also add about 8 ounces of 8600 reducer, and it's actually retarder, just a blush retarder. That 8600 retarder slows that paint down or your brush coat down and gets it to dry real slow. And I always strain everything I do. I've already mixed this thoroughly, and I'm gonna go ahead and add some to my brush coating bucket. You want to make sure this is really good and fresh. You don't want to use stuff that's thickened up. You can thin your brush coat back out with some more 8500 and get it to where it's a nice consistency to brush with. And then I always I use a 3-inch natural bristle brush to brush coat with, and I always go through it and I pull all the little strands. You see all those little strands falling out? You don't want any of that in your brush coat. So I pull all of those out. You'll still find them as you're brushing. Just reach back in and grab them, get them out of there, and finish your brush coat right on. Once you start brush coating, you'll want to do it in sections. You don't want to try and brush coat the whole thing at once. You want your brush coat to stay wet the whole time you're brushing, so that you don't leave what I call ropes in your brush coat. I see it in a lot of paint jobs out there, and it's where they've brushed it too dry, or they've tried to go and brush a second coat on. I don't brush a second coat on. I brush 1 coat on, and I end it there. And then when I'm mixing my paint, or my poly spray to do my first several coats of the paint process, I add 50% poly brush in with my first coat of silver rather than brushing a second coat like the Poly Fiber book reads. I add more poly brush in with my silver when I spray it the first time, because if you try and spray pure poly brush, it dries in the air on the way to your surface, and it'll leave spots everywhere. So I always mix my silver and my poly brush together on the first coat, and then I spray pure poly spray from there, 3 more cross coats to be sure I have a good surface. So I'm getting my brush good and cleaned out here. I've got my tack cloth. I'm going to reset the camera up over on the fuselage, and we're going to brush coat the bottom so I can just show you my method of brushing. May not be exactly the way everyone you've seen does it. They don't do it exactly the same as I do. It's just my method. You can do it the way you like. I use untinted poly brush because I just like the way it works. I can see what it's doing and it works fine. You can also use tinted poly brush, unless you're planning to finish out your paint the way I do on my fuselage, and I leave the silver showing on the inside, and that is my inside finish. I don't paint the inside of the fuselage, so the clear poly brush lets that show through nice, and it ends up with a nice interior, and you'll see that when we get into the paint process. So I've got my poly brush mixed up. I've got a little 8600 retarder in it, and we're ready to set up and go over to the fuselage and do some brush coating. Okay, we've got our fuselage ironed to 350 degrees all the way around the whole surface. We've mixed up our brush coat, and we're ready to go. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a tack cloth, and we're going to make sure there isn't anything laying on this surface. Now, we've just covered this today, so it's chances are it's probably fairly clean, but I like to go over everything just to make sure I got all the dust and lint off of it. So what I do is when I open up my tack cloths, I usually cut them in about 4 pieces so I can keep them fresh, and I just keep them in Ziploc bags when I'm not using them. So we're just going to go through and tack cloth this whole surface. We're going to start with the bottom, and then we'll work our way around to the sides. And when I'm brush coating the sides of the fuselage, I usually turn the fuselage up on its side so that I'm brush coating on a flat surface. That way it doesn't run real bad. Now, you do want your brush coat to flow through to the inside of your fabric, because that's what the paint actually sticks to. Paint will not stick to the polyester. The paint actually sticks to your poly brush coat. So that poly brush coat has to wick through the fabric so that it sandwiches the fabric in between 2 layers of the poly brush. So that's what we're shooting for, but we don't want it to run wild in there. We don't want it to get tacky looking. So we're tacked off on the bottom surface of this fuselage, and we're ready to start brush coating. Now what I do is I pick panels as I'm brush coating. I pick a spot that I want to do this whole section and get done, and then I jump to my next section. That way if my phone rings or anything happens that I've got to take a call or something, I'm not going to stop while I'm brush coating. I'll wait until I get done with at least this section, and then I'll return that call. So what we want to do is we just want to brush from the side to the center, like so. And then smooth that all out in one direction. I usually I use a rule, and it doesn't really matter which direction you brush, but it keeps me uniform in my work. Is I always try and do my final brushing in the flow of the air. So if the fuselage is moving forward through the air that way, I want my final brush coat to be this direction. That way, if you do see any kind of a brush stroke, it'll, for one thing, it'll be extremely light. But if you do, it's all in the same direction. So you don't want to take any chance on any of your poly brush running over the edges. So you just want to be extremely careful. And I'm right-handed, so I brush naturally in this direction. So I'll start at the beginning of my panel, right at that seam where I want to get that. And I always start from up in the center, that way I can run my brush off to the edge, and I don't have a lot of excess poly brush running over the side. So we're just going to go through. It's a nice cool day, so this is going to dry real slow. When it's real hot, you got to go a little faster. And you want quite a bit of poly brush on your surface, so you're dipping on every stroke, and you're laying a lot of product onto the fabric. And then you don't want to get too far down the road where you can't brush back over it to smooth it out. So I'll go about 18 inches, 24 inches, clean that up along the edge right there, and then I'll dry my brush out, and I'll just brush right back to that point where I decided to stop my panel at, which is right there. Now when I'm putting quite a bit of pressure on the fabric so that poly brush goes right on through the weave, and then I'll come back and do a light stroke to get any air bubbles or anything like that out of it. And then seeing as how I'm stopping at this panel right here, I'm gonna go ahead and just smooth that across. Then I'm ready to move right on forward. I'm just gonna grab my next spot. I'm brushing right over my seam and everything. That kind of does a double sealing on your seam that you got on the side, and that poly brush will soak up, mix right in with your poly tack, and it'll increase your bond, because your poly brush is also a structural adhesive. It's not it's not just a sealant. It's an adhesive also. So we'll go up another couple of feet. And then we'll just brush right into that last part that you just did to try and seam it all together. Just like so. I usually try and stop in different spots so I don't have a seam showing of where I stopped and started. And you can see that poly brush starting to run a little bit on the inside edges. That's okay. You don't want it to run too much, but it is covering both surfaces, so you are going to have a little bit. Right onto the front of your fuselage. Make sure everything gets covered well. Don't want to miss any spots, or it'll show up as open points in your paint that are really hard to seal back in if you miss them at this stage. And where I've started my brush stroke, there's usually quite a bit extra poly brush there, so I just go ahead and just clean my brush out on that first stroke, and after that you can pretty much just spread it on down. And you end up with a very neat poly brush job. Then you want to come back through, and if you find a hair anywhere, you can just grab that, just go ahead and touch that down. I like to get down in the light, take a look through my surface, make sure I don't have any hairs in there, and that all looks good. We're ready to go right on to our next section. So what I do at that point is I just go ahead and I just pick right back up where I left off on this seam and just start heading down toward the bottom. Again, I still pull my, even though I'm going the opposite direction, I still pull my poly brush from the center so that it doesn't want to run over my edges down onto the sides of my fabric. This is a nice narrow run, so sometimes you can pull two. We'll with one dip if it starts getting kind of narrow like that. And then we want to just go ahead and take that right on up to where we started this run at, which is right there. And you don't want to flick your brush or it'll leave drip marks all up in your other parts you just brush coated. Yeah, I know you can't see this section, but I'm heading right on down to the tail boom. Just like that. And we're going to clean our brush off real good. And we're going to come back in where I saw a hair right there, and I'll pick that up with my brush. And we'll look through in the glare of the light and find any little hairs that come out of this brush that's falling apart. Alright. Clean our little edge up right here. And head right on up to the other side. We'll pull it from the center again, just like we did on the other side. And like I said again, I'm putting a lot of product on the fabric. I'm really laying that in there. And that's starting to dry fairly quick. I can see it starting to dry up, so I'm going to go ahead and make a little bit shorter runs. And go ahead and get that smoothed on down. And you can kind of look back as you're going, and if you see any hairs show up to under your brush, you can go ahead and fix them right then. Keep working your way toward the back a little bit at a time. If you see it start drying behind you, you don't want to let that get too far, so just come back in and wet it back off and go ahead and finish back into your other run. You notice sometimes I take it a little further than the last stroke just to keep everything from ending in one spot. And we're just slowly but surely working our way right to the back of the fuselage. hair right there. Get that, brush back across it. There's another hair. And that's coming out just beautiful. So we're just going to take this right onto the back. And it's best while you're covering to go ahead and kind of get your brush coat out of the way as you go. You stand a lot less chance of any contaminants getting in your fabric if it's sealed. If the fabric's wide open, the fabric weave will hold dust, lint, anything like that, and you'll have a hard time getting a really smooth finished paint job. So I usually just go ahead and brush coat as I go. When I'm covering tail feathers, I normally cover all of the tail feathers at once, and then I brush coat them all in one run. I don't try and do each individual piece, but fuselage is probably the hardest part of the covering process, so that's why I started with that on this video series. Plus it gets it out of the way for me and I don't have it to look forward to. Alright, that's got the brush coat done on the bottom of the fuselage. Now I'll let that go ahead and set up all of the way before I flip this over on its side and start brush coating the sides, because I don't want anything to run any direction. I just want it to lay there nice and flat and dry just like it is. And there's several methods to brush coating. This is one I've used for a lot of years. I've covered a lot of airplanes, so it's always worked for me, and it works good. It just it brushes in. My paint's always sealed well. It paints well. I've never had any paint peel off of one of my airplanes that I've covered. It does a good job. And I have people tell me all the time, you need the tint in the poly brush so that you can see where you've been. But as you can see by watching this process in the video, you can see the sheen of the poly brush. It absolutely shows up real nice and lets you know where you've been and lets you know everything's doing good. All right, I'm going to finish this out without not being on the video. All I'm going to do is roll it up on the side and brush coat the sides. I'm going to brush coat the turtle deck, and then this fuselage is ready for the paint process, or at least the masking process before paint. Well, we've made it all the way through covering the Mark III Extra fuselage. I've gone on and brush coated the sides. I've brush coated the turtle deck. So this whole project ended up ironed to 350 degrees before I brush coated it. Brush coat's complete. Next step for this fuselage would be to go into the spray booth and get masked off for painting. But before we go there, we're going to jump over and start covering our vertical stabilizer and our rudder.